You go on spring break to forget responsibility, not to discover that strangers can wear the exact face of something you were never taught to recognize. I've told bits of these stories before, but not all in one night, not lined up like a procession of close calls. Tonight I want to put them next to each other. 3 real spring break horror stories. One took place in a rain-soaked cabin with someone pretending to be a forest ranger. The second happened halfway across the world in Acapulco, when a friend vanished off a club floor. The third looked like a normal Lakehouse party until everyone there started acting like they'd rehearsed the roles they were playing. They're different places, different people, same sharp edge. That moment when a place you thought was safe starts showing you otherwise. I still wake up thinking about them. Story 1. The Cabin Intruder. We drove out of town laughing, with music bumping and the kind of cheap snacks you only buy when you know you don't need to sleep. Anna wanted quiet. Hunter, her brother, wanted a break from the dorm and his night shifts. I wanted the woods, the promise of no one calling, no texts that mattered, and a stove we could light without worrying about neighbors. The place we rented was that kind of cabin you picture in movies. Small, a single road in, a gravel driveway that surrendered to pines and the smell of damp earth. The owner told us on the phone it was secluded, perfect for unplugging. We took that as a blessing. The first night it rained on and off. It wasn't the cinematic kind of rain, it was the small persistent kind that makes the porch slick, that ticks like someone counting in an empty room. We had a lantern and a pot of cheap coffee. Anna and I sat on the sagging couch, while Hunter fiddled with some card tricks he'd been learning. The whole place creaked in ways a house doesn't when it's full. In the corner, an outbuilding, a shed I guess, had a newer lock than the hinges suggested it should. It was padlocked, the kind of lock that looked like someone had replaced it recently with an extra thick metal loop. We noticed it almost as a joke. "New owner must be paranoid," Hunter said. And then the comment hung there longer than it should have, like a shadow that doesn't belong. Later, after a late dinner and some stupid dares around a camp stove, we all fell into a kind of tired peace. I remember the hum of insects beyond the windows, the way the rain made the pines sound like a distant ocean. Around 2 in the morning I heard it first. A soft thump like someone bumping the cabin wall with a fist. I lay still, convinced it was a branch. But then there was another, harder, and then a pause, and then quiet. I could tell I wasn't the only awake. Anna was breathing a little faster. Hunter had sleep like a loaded spring and wasn't as easy to read. We were young and a little drunk on the liberty of not having to answer for the next day, which in hindsight probably made us softer targets. It was only around 4 when the knocking changed into something that could not be explained away. There was a knock on the front door. Not a polite knock, but one that suggested impatience, someone used to doors opening when they demanded. Then a voice, a rough voice calling out something about a ranger doing welfare checks. He said his name in a way that was meant to sound official. He claimed there'd been reports of campers having trouble on that road, that he was checking on isolated cabins. I remember the voice well enough to know exactly how authoritative it tried to be. Authority has a cadence. He used it. Hunter peeked through a crack in the curtains and said, "Do we know the ranger?" I said, "Call the county or something." But of course none of us had his number. Hunter had his phone out faster than either of us, fingers fumbling, and he called the non-emergency line. We listened as the line rang like a countdown. The voice outside knocked again. He tried to be conversational. "You all out there?" Like someone testing a script he'd used before. That's what sticks with me most. The scripted tone, the politeness that tried not to be noticed. The person on the other end of Hunter's call told him plainly that there was no ranger scheduled, that no one had been dispatched to our stretch of road. The dispatch person, calm and professional and sounding like someone whose job was sleep-interrupted, said it didn't make sense. Hunter asked what we should do and was told to stay put and keep the door locked until help could get there. The dispatcher said they'd send a patrol to check. We breathed as if through a straw. The guy outside heard us breathe. That's the thing about close danger, it has a rhythm. You notice the tiny things that become loud. A shifted shadow, the animal's silent stretch of the yard when someone waits just beyond the trees. When we told the man through the door that we'd called the police, the tone changed. He started to sound impatient in a way that was meant to unsettle, like someone testing whether you could be worn down. He pounded the door, the force different from the earlier knocks, larger, angrier. Once he tried to open the lock with his shoulder. He called names, not our names, but the way people call when they're trying to establish proximity to you, inventing a relationship where there isn't one. I remember the sound of his boot near the threshold, like someone leaning heavy on a hinge. He began to beat the door with a rhythm that felt ritualistic, like percussion in a piece I had not been invited to. He didn't break the door. Instead, he threw a rock that shattered a back window with a violence so sharp it split the quiet apart. Glass scattered across the floor, a million thin knives catching moonlight. We moved like people do when they are practiced in survival films and unpracticed in real life, together, silent, quick. Hunter grabbed a flashlight and a heavy cast-iron skillet we'd been using for bacon earlier. I found a hatchet, and Anna held a chair that had once been comically small, but right then seemed like an instrument of life. We made a war out of kitchen utensils, which is to say we panicked and tried to be brave. There were covers of light from cars in the distance, the headlights of a patrol in that thin blue-silver way they cut through rain, and then the sound of radio static as the officer called in. The banging had stopped by then, as if the person outside had decided his mission had failed. When the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, the officer moved alone and methodically, the way training teaches you to be small and brave. He checked the perimeter, walked the thin yard with a flashlight, and told us afterwards that there was no sign of the man, no footprints of recent origin beyond the crushed grass near the window, only dampness and the heavy air of something that had been and vanished. We left that night. We didn't try to be heroic or explain. We packed like people who had realized too late that possessions mean less than the distance between you and the dark. Anna held her keys like a talisman in the passenger seat. Hunter sat with his head against the glass and didn't say anything for a long time. The drive back felt like sliding away from a place that had been waiting for us to leave, the trees closing, the rain quiet, a silence that felt suspiciously relieved. There are parts of that night that I replay and can't place. The man seemed to know where the outbuilding was. He knew how to rattle a hinge so that the sound of wood would travel inside the cabin like a message. Did he follow us from town? Did he watch the rental listing and the arrival times? I don't know, I can't say. What I can say is how it felt, calculated. He didn't yell slurs or issue specific threats. He performed a role that had been rehearsed. And the rehearsal is the thing that chills me. We were the audience to someone's script, and we had no idea what act was next. Afterwards, I kept thinking about the padlock. Why padlock a shed in the woods unless you had something worth hiding? There were nights when I would lie awake and imagine a stranger moving around in the dark, holding a key ring and a clipboard, checking off which cabins had answered and which had not. I felt guilty for sleeping in the same bed as Anna that night. Survivor's guilt is strange like that. Not from violence done, but from the gap between fear and the person you love who didn't have to carry it. We didn't call the rental company until daylight. I wanted them to know, wanted something done. They apologized in a way that had no weight, promised a refund, and told us they would increase security. It was all corporate balm. I kept that feeling with me for weeks. The idea that someone could stand outside your door and masquerade as a helper. It's the inversion that stings. Someone using trust as a trick. Hunter still jokes sometimes, trying to press it into a story we can laugh at. But I don't laugh. I flinch at the tap of a fist on any surface above the first floor. I find myself checking whether voices outside have the cadence of authority or the cadence of practice. If you're into real stories like this and want more that make you double-check your locks, go ahead and hit subscribe. I've got 2 more that are worse in their own ways. But before I move on, there's one last thing from that night. In the weeks after, a friend of a friend told me about break-ins in other cabins on the same road. Nothing conclusive, just rumors. Cars reported stolen in town, strangers seen pacing driveways. That's the trouble with rumor. It doesn't give you neat endings. It gives you a map of possibilities, and those possibilities are what keep the mind awake. Story 2. Sahil in Acapulco. I'm not good at being subtle about risk. That's probably part of why these stories happen to people like me. On paper, the fraternity trip should have been harmless. A big group, a resort with filtered water and palms, an overpriced pool bar where everything tasted of sugar and lime. We were reckless, self-aware, and convinced nothing dramatic could touch us in a place where everyone else seemed to be looking for the same kind of forgetfulness. Sahil, though, Sahil was a different flavor of impulsive. He was the guy who mixed confidence with a total lack of fear, who thought rules were suggestions. We loved him for it, and were tired of him for it in equal measure. The day we landed, the resort was exactly what you expect. White buildings, someone carrying a tray of shots like the future, was a stack of plastic cups, a DJ leaning over a table and trying to make a palm tree sound like a drum. Brands of sunscreen, neon towels, and strangers who nodded like they'd been friends for years. We split into cliques easily, the players who wanted clubs until dawn, the ones who wanted quiet drinks, the couples clutching each other like that was their unspoken safety plan. Sahil's plan was always to push the boundary an inch past polite danger. He went missing on the first night we hit the club. The dance floor was a heat map of bodies, a close, moving thing. At some point Sahil disappeared into that warm churn. We assumed he'd wandered out for air or got distracted by someone offering something. Deals in the club move fast, whispered promises that don't ask for identification. When an hour passed and a stranger at the bar told us a story about a guy who left with someone, something in my chest tightened in a way that wasn't just impatience. Phones were checked, messages left. People split and reconvened like search parties made of vacationers. Sahil came back at dawn. He looked different. That's a shallow thing to say, but it's the honest observation. His shirt half-tucked, hair matted, face swollen in places he'd later say were slammed into a car seat. His phone was destroyed. He told us fragments at first in the shower of the resort, in hushed words over lukewarm coffee. 2 men approached him, he said. One short, the other taller, and someone translating between them. They offered something that would make him feel better, and he, being Sahil, agreed before we could roll our eyes. He would tell the story later with a man's reflex to minimize and then swell into anger, like waves that couldn't decide their shape. They moved him away from the clamor of the club under the guise of privacy, he said. He sampled it. He told them he wanted air. They led him to a corner where the lights were weaker and the bodies fell away. Then it was a shove and a blindfold and a boot in his ribs. He remembered the car, a trunk slammed, a confined dark, the soft thump of a tire on gravel. He said he tried to explain who he was, that he was American and a college kid, that his friends were in the resort. Details you only offer frantically, the kind of facts you think might humanize you to people who already have decided otherwise. There's an odd grammar to panic. Sahil described it as fragments, the smell of cheap cologne, the metallic taste of fear, a hand on his jaw that pushed his chin up like he was answering to a question. He said they robbed him. Phone, money, whatever they thought they could take. And then they hit him, not with the brutality that would hospitalize him, but in a way that left him bruised and shaken, enough to mark the night without letting it drown him. He told us they talked among themselves, and he heard snippets in which they debated him as if he were cargo. Too many Americans out, he remembered one of them saying in Spanish, which someone translated roughly as too visible. It's a detail that doesn't feel like luck but like a bargaining chip. Being surrounded by people who were obviously one group and dangerous in another language may have worked in his favor, or at least not worked against him as much as it might have. They threw him out near a side street and told him not to look back. He stumbled back to the resort, as if someone had rewired his legs. Seeing him appear at the entrance was like watching someone rise from the sea with a story in his mouth. He sat down with us on the concrete and put a hand over his face, and then started to tell us in a voice that tried to be rational and kept sliding into something raw. I thought I was done, he said. I thought that was it. We did the things people do in that moment, that feel like grown-up responses and sound small in memory. Someone called the front desk. Someone else found the number for local police. We debated whether to go after the car description he gave, whether to push for help, whether calling the police would help more than it would complicate a night already soaked in language and distance. Sahil wanted to file something. He wanted the small ritual of report and recounting. Others in the group whispered about reputations, about ruining the trip, about getting dragged into a local maze that would take more time than our spring break allowed. There was shame, oddly, too. Shame for being the guy who would bring the cops into a vacation scene. We made a choice, and it was a cowardly one masked in the tired logic of, what would that even solve? There are moments that I go back to and stall on, as if waiting will make them reveal a different shape. Sahil told us that during the drive, one of the men cursed softly when he realized they were passing a stretch with an obvious American crowd. The driver muttered and said something like "too many eyes," and then they changed their mind. That detail is the one the rest of us said out loud in the aftermath, with a brittle laugh, as if humor can carve out the horror. That his identity as one of many Americans may have been the thing that saved him from a worse ending. But I refuse to call it salvation. It's an accident of scale. It's a small mercy in a story that should have had no mercy at all. He was lucky. He was not safe. When we sat in a circle on the sand, passing a bottle and counting tiny wounds like badges, something else settled in the group, an unspoken decision to keep quiet. We didn't report fully. Fear, embarrassment, and the practical difficulty of cross-border policing in a place where we were transient tourists all tangled up. Sahil was angry at himself and at the guys who didn't insist on action. I felt a memory like a bruise forming. This quiet pact to move on, to protect reputations, to keep the trip more or less intact for everyone. It felt like choosing a version of safety that would force us to carry what happened instead of letting someone else carry it for us. They say trauma is a private geography, and maybe they're right. After that night, Sahil didn't speak much about it. He laughed too loudly at stupid jokes and avoided corners where people could have pulled him aside. For weeks, he refused to walk alone to class. We pretended to respect his space and simultaneously judged the fact that he hadn't pressed for anything. I judged myself for not insisting more, for letting the group momentum carry us towards silence. I want to make something clear. I am not saying the men were part of any organized international ring. I'm saying that in a foreign city at night, with language as a thin sheet between us and strangers, we found ourselves negotiating our own fear like a currency. That vulnerability is the real terror of the story. You don't just lose a phone. You can find yourself bargaining for your safety with facts about where you are from. It's humiliating and small and massive all at once. The last thing Sahil told me before he stopped, and it's the detail I can't shake, was how ordinary everything felt at first. The club, the lights, the offer that sounded like a promise and not a trap. The ordinariness is what made the extraordinary possible. The way a smile turns into a hand around a wrist without warning, the way a shoulder becomes a shove, the way strangers rearrange a night. And then, after those things, one of the men said the words that made Sahil's throat close. "We'll take him for a bit." They didn't use the word kidnap in a theatrical sense. It was a transactional sentence, like a line item. Sahil remembered the car pulling away and the club's neon blurring behind them. He told us about the inside of the car, how the lights from the street came like flashes that meant nothing, like snapshot evidence that didn't help him. He could hear voices in the other language and couldn't tell which were threats and which were instructions. I remember his face when he described the moment the car slowed down and stopped in a dark spot. He said he felt the weight of the world in the way we often feel it, compacted. He thought about what he would say if they opened the door and asked him his name. He practiced being small on the inside while his body shook on the outside. He thought about screaming. He thought about bargaining. Then someone touched his shoulder in a way that told him not to make any sudden moves. They pushed him halfway out of the car and told him to run, and he did. He ran like someone running from a life that might have ended if things had gone a little differently. Shall stop the story there for a minute, because if there's a single ugly truth to this, it's that the part we let sit unreported becomes the part that breeds the next thing. Sahil's return should have been the end of the story, and in some ways it was. He came back and he lived. But the way we treated that survival, the silence, the decision to not press authorities, the choice to keep the trip intact at the expense of telling the whole truth, altered us. It left a residue of what-ifs that hardened into a habit. We tried to laugh it off, but the laughter always had an edge. In the mornings, when the sun was too bright against the resort's facade, Sahil would sit on the balcony and look out at the water with a distance I'd never seen before. He stopped accepting drinks from strangers. He started carrying his phone in both hands like a talisman. Little things, But repetition builds walls. We learned that silence is an action too. It's a decision that moves the story from public record into private scar. I was going to tell you how the rest of that night unfolded, how we argued, and how one of our friends almost did go down to the police station before we decided against it. But there's another part to this morning after that I want to linger on, because it's the seam where group dynamics and personal fear meet. We were a cluster of young people who thought rules were flexible, and when the rules were real, we bent them in ways that later felt shameful. There's a particular thing that haunts me about being young and in a group, the way safety gets distributed unevenly. Some of us carry the story like a hot coal, and some of us don't. Sahil carried it differently, and that difference changed us. I could tell you everything now. The phone calls, the murmured confessions, the nights after when Sahil wouldn't join us in the crowded places. I could tell you that we mostly pretended it hadn't happened, because pretending is easier when you're surrounded by others who prefer a windowless comfort. But there's a moment in the middle of the night that I can't let go of, so I won't move past it yet. I want to keep the tension here, like a pressed breath, because the part that comes next is the part where choices are made, to report, to hide, to become a cautionary statistic, or to be the quiet warning whispered at future parties. I want to tell you about the car, and the moment Sahil realized he might be bargaining for something far worse than money, but that belongs to the part of the story I'll get to next. For now, picture the dark inside that vehicle, the smell, the hands, the sound of the tire on gravel, and the city as a distant heartbeat. Picture Sahil's throat working like someone swallowing a tide. Picture the brief, absurd thought that if he started to recite where he was from, it might change whatever negotiations were happening in a language he didn't share with the men holding him. It's that razor-thin space between survival and something else, where choices are fragile. We left Acapulco with new rules, but I want you to understand that rules are easy to make and hard to live by when you're with friends who are trying to keep the good times untouched. That is the real lesson. It's not just the person who took advantage of someone in the club. It's the group that decides what to protect and what to bury. That silence is the thing that allows predators to assume they can keep doing what they do in the shadows. And it's an uncomfortable mirror for all of us. I should stop here for a second, because the next part is the hardest to tell without losing the thread of what mattered afterward. There's a particular detail Sahil mentioned in a whisper only once, about a license plate, and the way the translator flipped a phrase that implied the driver might be local to the area where tourists are common targets. It's a small detail, and those are often the most useful for anyone trying to make sense of what happened. But it's also the kind of detail you don't want to overplay, because overplaying makes the story into something it isn't, a neatly solved case. This was messy, and it remained that way. I'm going to leave it there for now, not because there isn't more to tell, but because piling everything on top of the adrenaline you felt in that car would be unnecessary. There is still the part where Sahil returns and the collective choice not to escalate the issue. And that's a story about us, about the way groups protect themselves at the expense of truth. But I want to switch gears soon and tell you about the third one, because if you think a stranger in a club or a man pretending to be a ranger are the only faces danger wears, you'll find the third story hits differently. It's the one that begins with a smile, a clipboard, and a bowl of keys. Story 3. The Lakehouse host and the fake party. It started like any decent spring break setup. A long drive, cheap fast food wrappers, a playlist that tried too hard to be the Saturday of our lives. Anna wanted a weekend with space, somewhere big enough to feel anonymous, but private enough to let the group fall apart without anyone judging. Lena texted that she'd found a place on the lake, a house that looked like it belonged on a postcard. 2 stories, a wraparound deck, a dock, like a promise. Colby volunteered to drive. We piled into his car with the swagger of people who had already decided we would have fun no matter what. The sun was low when we pulled up the gravel path. The lake lay flat and blue, boats dotted like punctuation marks. The house was bigger up close, the kind of place meant to hold more bodies than furniture. Someone met us at the driveway with a clipboard. He smiled. That smile is worth remembering. Not aggressive, not cold, but practiced, the kind a fundraiser uses when they already know how you'll respond. He introduced himself as the host. He wore a t-shirt with the lake's name, and a name tag that gleamed under the sun. He had a bowl on the table by the door filled with keys. The keys clinked in a way that sounded ordinary, like promise and procedure fused into metal. "Welcome, everyone," he said, as if he'd been waiting for a script that included us. He asked us to sign the clipboard. He said it was just for security, and that he'd be keeping everyone's keys so no one went down to the dock drunk and locked themselves out. He talked about parking and the shed where spare things were kept. He spoke fast and with small jokes, as if to make us relax into what he wanted. Some people laughed when he made a little quip about the neighbors. Others handed their keys over without thinking. Anna hesitated, which is when the host's eyes shifted in a way I didn't like. A small, calculating pause. The first odd thing I noticed was how many people in that room claimed to know someone I didn't recognize. They kept dropping names. "Oh, I met you at Leah's party last fall. I was at Taylor's barbecue. We went to high school with Jared." The parallels were too neat. Groups from our side clustered together and compared notes, but the other groups seemed to snap into pattern when they talked about mutual acquaintances. Backstories started to sound like rehearsed lines because they repeated the same small details. Hometowns mentioned in the exact same cadence, shared college majors that matched slightly too well. People smiled at each other with a familiarity that read like an auditioned friendship. Then there were the couples who left early. On the first night, a pair said they were going to the shed to grab something and never rejoined the party. They said they'd be back in a minute. Their car, parked near the shed, stayed put. That stuck with me because usually people left and took their cars, and you don't forget a car that's still where you parked it. Later, someone joked about them going skinny dipping, but the joke landed weird and was swallowed. I kept looking at the dark line of trees by the shed and thinking about doors behind which people could disappear if they wanted to. The host's speech had a rhythm as he made his rounds. He asked where everyone was from and made a note on his clipboard. He asked who was sleeping where and if anyone needed a ride into town. He asked for keys, and he kept them all in that bowl like a puppet master gathering palms. When a couple asked to keep their keys because they planned on leaving early, the host said no, kept shaking his head, and smiled like he was disappointed someone wouldn't be staying longer. "It's for everyone's safety," he said. Safety in his mouth had the flavor of an explanation that closes conversation. There were small things that stacked into a pattern. People who offered almost identical answers when asked where they were staying. Someone who laughed a second too long at a joke and then drifted away to the same side of the house each time. A woman who had a story about being a photographer and who was always hovering near doorways with a camera that never took pictures. Anna noticed it too and kept saying, "It feels off." In that way you say something out loud to see if you're the only one who noticed. At one point Lena pulled me aside and said, "Did you see the way he wrote our names?" She meant the host. His handwriting on the clipboard had angles, almost like it was matching keys to faces by a system we didn't understand yet. He wrote down where people would sleep, and then tacked colored tags to some keys before dropping them into the bowl. Why tag some keys, and not others? Why keep the bowl where anyone could see it? The bowl started to look less like a courtesy and more like inventory. Colby got a text from a friend who'd been in charge of organizing the weekend. The message was short. "Hey, leave your keys with the host, he's covering everything." The friend's name itself was oddly formal, the kind of text you send when everything has been shortened to logistical necessity. Later, when Lena tried to call that friend to ask a question about the house rules, the line went straight to voicemail. She shrugged it off and said maybe the phone was dead. We were all trying not to let small anomalies become the whole story. The escalation came slowly, the way a wave builds before it suddenly swallows you. Later that night, a few of us left the living room to find our keys. Anna and I went down the hall toward the coat hooks where the host had arranged a display of keys. He'd installed a long strip of pegboard and labeled each peg with small handwritten tags. He didn't lock anything. He didn't need to. The keys hung like ornaments, ours among them. The host had kept his clipboard on a side table, and when he slid his fingers across it, he did it with a private confidence, as if memorizing an order he already controlled. I told Anna to wait while I stepped forward to grab our keys. She started to follow me, and then the host stepped between us with the casual formality of someone performing a procedure. "I'll get those for you," he said, in a voice meant to be helpful. That was the moment the air in the hall shifted from merely weird to dangerous. The host's hand moved with a familiarity that was too practiced. He knew exactly which hook held our key. He plucked it as if he'd had it in his palm before. When I reached for it, he withdrew a half-step and smiled that same practiced smile. "No, it's protocol," he said. "I'll escort you." The word escort sounded like control. He said it like someone wrapping a sentence around your options so tightly that only one would fit. Anna bristled. She tried to go around him, but he put a hand out in a way that was not violent but strongly possessive. Colby had followed us into the hallway by then. He said, "Hey man, give us the keys, we can take them." The host nodded as if agreeing, and then, to my surprise, produced 2 slips of paper and slid them into the same clipboard. "Just a minute," he said, eyes calm, the kind of calm that looks like thoughtfulness and smells like calculation. I felt watched. The living room behind us grew quieter. The music downstairs dulled as if someone had pulled a curtain across the speakers. People began to cluster by the windows, watching the hall as people watch the last scene of a movie. You could feel the groupness of them, the way a crowd compacts its attention until it becomes solid. That's when the couple on the far side of the deck, the ones who had said they would be back from the shed, came out and stood in the doorway. They didn't look surprised to see us. They didn't look like they'd just returned. They had the same fixed quality as the others. The deck hummed with a quiet that felt staged. I'd like to say I kept my cool. I didn't. "Give me back our keys," I said, shorter than I meant, and it sounded urgent in a way I hadn't planned. The host complied, but the act of his compliance was strange. He led us to the pegboard, waved his hand, and pulled the keys from hooks as if he were reciting a list in his head. He handed them to me in a neat stack. I fumbled them into my pocket and felt a stupid rush of relief. Anna and I turned toward the door like 2 people who have rehearsed escape and then improvise it. That's when the house revealed the last thing that made the whole setup sinister. As we passed the doorway, dozens of people on the deck lined up and turned to watch us go. Not the casual, half-attentive glance of partygoers, a coordinated, silent front of faces. They formed a wall of observers who did not smile, did not shout us a farewell. They simply watched, their heads tilted, as if we were actors playing our roles for an audience that had decided long ago what would happen next. It felt like a theater with no exit plan. Colby shoved the car into drive in an urgency I'd never seen from him. Anna kept checking the rear view, as if expecting someone to appear in the middle of the road. As the gravel bit into the tires and the truck moved forward, I glanced in the mirror and saw the house shrinking behind us under the moonlight, the people on the deck still standing in that line like a final, unspeaking jury. For a long while after we thought the worst had been that they wanted to keep keys, that they wanted control. But there is a different sort of violation in being seen as movable property in someone's logistical list. They had assumed our compliance, and the way they organized themselves had convinced them they could expect it. The aftermath settled quickly into a peculiar mix of anger and disbelief. We told ourselves versions of the event that made us feel smarter and safer. Colby said we were overreacting. Anna said we left at the right time. Lena said something about instincts and privacy. We tried to make sense of why the host had collected keys at all. Maybe it was a communal courtesy gone wrong. Maybe he'd had a recent problem with lockouts and thought this was helpful. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding amplified by too much alcohol, and the way strangers fill silence with stories that suit them. What gnawed at me, though, was the way things didn't add up. A week later, Lena pulled me aside and said she'd been poking around on social media and found something strange. The girl we all thought had organized the trip, the friend who'd texted Colby about the keys, had reported her phone stolen 2 days before the house was booked. She had sent us confirmation emails from an account that had been active earlier, but that showed odd gaps. When Lena called to ask questions, she got a voicemail from an automated service saying the number belonged to someone who had recently had their device compromised. The organizer's online presence had holes. She hadn't coordinated the way a real planner would. Her messages had an odd tone, like forwarded instructions, rather than personal contact. We discovered that the person who seemed to have set everything up hadn't been on the dock with us at all, and some of the confirmations came from emails that might have been created to make the booking look legitimate. We could have turned it into an investigation. We could have filed a police report, reached out to the rental platform, called the organizer, demanded answers. Instead, we did the same thing we'd done in other situations. We circulated excuses. We framed it as a weird fluke. We told each other that people make mistakes online, that phones get stolen, that coincidences happen. It was easier to make those small concessions than to expose ourselves to the procedural awkwardness of actual follow-through. We let the possibility that someone had manufactured a setup hang in the air and then thinly disguised it with rationalizations. I still think about that deck at night, the way a dozen faces can turn a private escape into a public performance. I think about the bowl of keys and the clipboard and how small acts of organization can become instruments of control. The aftertaste of that weekend is a long one. It's the habit of checking whether the houses we walk into have locks that we control, the way I count my keys obsessively now, the little ritual of closing my palm around them like a promise to myself. What connects the three of these stories, the ranger at the cabin, Sahil's abduction in Acapulco, and the Lakehouse whose smile felt rehearsed, is not a single villain. It's a pattern. It's the way strangers can use the language of help to mask intent, the way groups decide what to prioritize and what to bury, the way ordinary kindness can be a costume. All three scenes share an ugly cousin: ambiguity. There's always the part of the story that can be explained away, rationalized or softened. That grayness is also how predators sometimes find comfort. It's the space where "it could have been nothing" becomes an excuse to stop asking questions. I don't tell these things to make you paranoid. I tell them because memory is a warning system we can all learn from. There are practical moves that can tilt a situation from vulnerable to safer without turning your life into a fortress. Some of these moves are obvious. Some of them are just about listening to the small alarm in your chest that says, "This doesn't fit." The trick is honoring that alarm before you rationalize it away. Here are the things I learned, painfully and in pieces, from those 3 nights. Keep control of your keys and your means to leave. Don't hand them over to strangers for safety unless you can verify why and who is responsible. Share your location with at least one person who isn't part of the immediate group, and check in with them at set times. Sometimes distance gives you perspective you don't have in the moment. Trust your instincts when something feels rehearsed or too tidy. If people's answers seem practiced, if stories line up too neatly, take a step back and reassess. Avoid isolating a friend in unfamiliar settings. If someone disappears, involve local authorities or resort staff early. Don't let embarrassment or a desire to keep the trip intact override safety. When something happens in a group, talk about it openly and record the facts. Silence protects nobody. It protects the possibility that someone else might be hurt the same way. I could give you more tips. I could tell you to carry a whistle or to have an emergency cash stash. Those things matter. But the bigger lesson for me was moral and social. Don't let the group's desire for a good time override the need to respond to danger. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is say the awful sentence no one wants to hear. "No, we need to go." These stories have stuck with me because the endings were never neat. There was no cinematic reveal where a mastermind is unmasked. There was only a pattern: rehearsed authority, sudden disappearance, a line of watchers, a friend spat out of a car onto gravel. Those endings, or the lack of them, are what keep me alert. They teach me to value suspicion not as cynicism, but as a survival skill. They teach me to save my courage for the moment when it actually matters. If one thing should linger after you hear these 3 stories, let it be this: the world doesn't only wear obvious faces. Sometimes danger comes looked like help, like a clipboard, a name tag, a practiced laugh. Treat strange consistency as suspicious, not charming. If you have a spring break horror story, something that made you rethink a night, drop it in the comments. Share what happened and how you handled it. We learn from each other's mistakes the way survivors often do. If you found this useful, like and subscribe for more first-person accounts. Take those tips seriously. Stay with friends who will listen, and when you feel something is off, don't let the comfort of the moment press you into silence. I told you 3 stories tonight. They're real in the only way that matters to me, true in memory, and in the way they keep me cautious. If you ever find yourself in a house where someone is collecting keys or at a club where offers come wrapped in a friendly voice, remember these nights. Remember the padlock that didn't belong, the translator who flipped a phrase that saved a life, the bowl of keys and the line of watchers. Remember to leave before the script can be finished. Stay safe.